Down to this, an emergency request to the U.S. Supreme Court for a stay of execution in the case of Theodore Bundy has been rejected this evening. The vote was 5-4. Bundy is scheduled to die in Florida's electric chair tomorrow morning at 7. There may still be some last-ditch legal maneuvers that could cause yet another delay in the execution, including an appeal for clemency to the governor of Florida. But just by way of background, since 1925 in Florida, there have been 202 appeals for clemency, and only 6 have been granted. And Governor Bob Martinez, who will have to make that clemency decision on Ted Bundy, has already indicated that he wants the execution to take place. Indeed, Bundy's murders, those for which he is being executed, there are 3, and at least 20 others to which he has confessed, have made his execution a rather popular event. Here's more on the Bundy story from Nightline correspondent Judd Rose.
These are just a few of Ted Bundy's victims, the dead and the living.
I say this for each member of my family, and I'm certain for the other families too. Nothing is ever the same again.
I find myself even now when I'm in a crowd looking for
everything he did to the girls, the bludgeoning and the strangulation, humiliating their bodies, torturing them. I feel that the electric chair is too good for him.
It's been a long time, 15 years since the first murder, 10 years since he went to death row. But now it's just hours. Unless there's a last-minute stay, at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, they'll throw the switch on the electric chair at Florida State Prison, and finally, the tragic, twisted saga of Ted Bundy will be over.
He is an affront to civilized society. He decided that he was not going to play by anybody's rules, that he wanted to kill, and he was going to kill, and he was going to continue killing.
He's convicted of 3 murders, but authorities think he actually killed 36 and perhaps many more. There have been other notorious serial killers. David Berkowitz, New York's son of Sam, who killed 6 women. Henry Lee Lucas, who claimed to have killed hundreds in the Southwest. John Wayne Gacy, convicted of murdering 33 young men near Chicago. And Juan Corona, convicted in the deaths of 25 farm workers in Northern California. Misfits, loners, drifters. But not Ted Bundy.
Here is a man who seemingly had everything. He's intelligent, he's charismatic, he's handsome. He was on his way in the Republican Party. I thought he would be governor of Washington now rather than going to the chair.
Bundy had gone to college and law school, worked in politics. Men admired him, women liked him, but behind the mask was a depraved killer. Starting in early 1974, he began stalking pretty young women. Once he got them alone, he would bludgeon them, rape them, strangle them, then leave their bodies in the wild for the animals to finish them off. Many were never found.
Ted enjoyed the thrill. There was an inward thrill in selecting a victim, and it was usually at night. It was usually after he'd had a couple of beers to steady his nerves, and he would go out and he would literally hunt.
The murders spread from Washington to Oregon, Utah, and Colorado, and when Bundy was finally caught, everyone was stunned.
We still don't believe it. It just can't be. I keep shaking my head day after day, saying, how can this be? Because our son is the best son in the world. He's a very normal, active boy.
And Bundy himself showed his peculiar arrogance, saying the legal system would prove his innocence.
Well, I'm sure it works, and you've got to have faith it'll work, or else you'll be reduced to some kind of, mumbling idiot.
But Bundy wasn't done yet. He escaped from jail, was recaptured, and escaped again. Changing his appearance like a chameleon, Bundy continued to kill until his bloody journey brought him to Florida, where in January of 1978, he went wild in this sorority house, viciously assaulting 4 women. 2 died. A month later, he raped and strangled a 12-year-old girl. Shortly after, Ted Bundy was caught.
Since I have been in Dade County, I've been allowed to...
Don't shake your finger at me, young man. Don't shake your finger at me, young man.
Bundy's trial, complete with live TV cameras and the defendant acting as his own lawyer, was a national sensation. Finally convicted and sentenced to die, Bundy still refused to accept the blame for his crimes.
Because it is not a sentence of me, it is a sentence of someone else who's not standing here today.
Ted's a sociopath, an antisocial personality. They have no consciences as we know it. They truly feel no empathy for other people. They don't understand other people's pain. The rest of us are there to make them feel better.
Bundy's been consistent to the end. It was only this weekend that he began admitting his crimes, thinking it would buy him some time. Today, Connie Wilcox learned that Bundy had confessed killing her daughter Nancy 14 years ago.
Ted Bundy needs to die. He needed to die 10 years ago or longer, and he should not have been allowed to live this long.
In the places he ravaged, few disagree, like on the campus of Florida State.
Personally, I think he should be fried right away. What he did was grotesque.
And the impending execution has been the source of all sorts of gallows humor.
I'm making a statement that I think it's time for Bundy to go.
And apparently it is. Ted Bundy's execution is regarded by most with the same lack of remorse he always showed his human prey.
Could even talk to me.
For the record, you are guilty of killing many women and girls.
Yes. Yes, that's true.
Ted, how did it happen? Take me back. What are the antecedents of the behavior that we've seen? So much grief, so much sorrow, so much pain for so many people. Where did it start? How did this moment come about?
I grew up in a wonderful home with two dedicated and loving parents, one of 5 brothers and sisters. But as a young boy, and I mean a boy of 12 or 13, certainly, that I encountered outside the home again, in the local grocery store, the local drugstore, the softcore pornography, what people call softcore. But as I think I explained to you last night, Dr. Dobson, in an anecdote, that as young boys do, we explored the back roads and sideways and byways of our neighborhood, and oftentimes people would dump the garbage and whatever they were cleaning out of their house, and from time to time we'd come across pornographic books of a harder nature than more graphic, you might say, more explicit nature than we would encounter, let's say, in your local grocery store. My experience with, I'd say, pornography generally, but with pornography that deals on a violent level with sexuality, is that once you become addicted to it, and I look at this as a kind of addiction, like other kinds of addiction, I would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material. Like an addiction, you keep craving something which is harder, something which gives you a greater sense of excitement, until you reach the point where the pornography only goes so far. You reach that jumping off point where you begin to wonder if maybe actually doing it will give you that which is beyond just reading about it or looking at it.
Ted, after you committed your first murder, what was the emotional effect on you? What happened in the days after that?
It was like coming out of some kind of horrible trance or dream. I can only liken it to after, I don't want to over-dramatize it, but to have been possessed by something so awful and so alien, and then the next morning wake up from it, remember what happened, and realize that basically, in the eyes of the law, certainly in the eyes of God, you're responsible to wake up in the morning and realize what I had done, and with a clear mind and all my essential moral and ethical feelings intact at that moment. Absolutely horrified that I was capable of doing something like that.
You really hadn't known that before?
Basically, I was a normal person. I wasn't some guy hanging out at bars or a bum, or I wasn't a pervert in the sense that, you know, people look at somebody and say, I know there's something wrong with him, and just tell. I mean, I was essentially a normal person. I had good friends. I led a normal life, except for this one small but very potent and very destructive segment of it that I kept very secret and very close to myself and didn't let anybody know about it. And part of the shock and horror from my dear friends and family years ago when I was first arrested was that there was no clue. They looked at me and they looked at the all-American boy. And I mean, I wasn't perfect, but I want to be quite candid with you. I was okay. Okay, I was. The basic humanity and basic spirit that God gave me was intact, but unfortunately became overwhelmed at times. And I think people need to recognize that it's not some kind of those of us who have been so much influenced by violence in the media, in particular pornographic violence, are not some kinds of inherent monsters. We are your sons and we are your husbands. And we grew up in regular families. And pornography can reach out and snatch a kid out of any house today. He snatched me out of my home. It snatched me out of my home 20, 30 years ago. And as diligent as my parents were, and they were diligent in protecting their children, and as good a Christian home as we had, and we had a wonderful Christian home, there is no protection against the kinds of influences that are loose in a society that tolerates.
You feel this really deeply, don't you? Ted, outside these walls right now, there are several hundred reporters that wanted to talk to you.
Yeah.
And you asked me to come here from California because you had something you wanted to say. This hour that we have together is not just an interview with a man who's scheduled to die tomorrow morning. I am here and you're here because of this message that you're talking about right here. You really feel that hardcore pornography and the doorway to it, softcore pornography, is doing untold damage to other people and causing other women to be abused and killed the way you did others.
Listen, I'm no social scientist, and I haven't done a survey. I mean, I don't pretend that I know what John Q. Citizen thinks about this. But I've lived in prison for a long time now. And I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence just like me. And without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography, without question, without exception, deeply influenced and consumed by an addiction to pornography. There's no question about it. The FBI's own study on serial homicide shows that the most common interest among serial killers is pornography.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's real. It's true.
Ted, what would your life have been like without that influence? You can only speculate.
Yeah. Well, I know it would have been far better, not just for me, and it's, excuse me for being so self-centered here. It would have been a lot better for me and lots of other people. I know that lots of other innocent people, victims and families. It would have been a lot better. There's no question, but it would have been a fuller life. Certainly a life that would not have involved, I'm absolutely certain, would not have involved this kind of violence that I have committed.
I'm sure, Ted, if I were able to ask you the questions that are being asked out there, one of the most important as you come down to perhaps your final hours, Are you thinking about all those victims out there and their families who are so wounded, you know, years later, their lives have not returned to normal. They will never return to normal.
Absolutely.
Are you carrying that load, that weight? Is the remorse there?
Yes, absolutely. In the past few days, myself and a number of investigators have been talking about unsolved cases, murders that I was involved in. And it's hard to talk about all these years later because it revives in me all those terrible feelings and those thoughts that I have steadfastly and diligently dealt with, I think successfully, with the love of God. And yet it's reopened that, and I felt the pain and I felt the horror again of all that. And I can only hope that those who I have harmed, those who I've caused so much grief, even if they don't believe my expression of sorrow and remorse, will believe what I'm saying now, that there is loose in their towns and their communities people like me today whose dangerous impulses are being fueled day in and day out by violence in the media in its various forms, particularly sexualized violence. And what scares me, and let's come into the present now, because what I'm talking about happened 20, 30 years ago, that is, in my formative stages. And what scares and appalls me, Dr. Dobson, is when I see what's on cable TV, some of the movies, I mean, some of the violence in the movies that come into homes today with stuff that they wouldn't show in X-rated adult theaters 30 years ago. This stuff...
The slasher movies that you're talking about.
That stuff is, I'm telling you, from personal experience, the most, that is graphic violence on screen, particularly as it gets into the home to children who may be unattended or unaware that they may be a Ted Bundy who has that vulnerability to that predisposition to be influenced by that kind of behavior, by that kind of movie, that kind of violence. There are kids sitting out there switching the TV dial around and come upon these movies late at night, or I don't know when they're on, but they're on and any kid can watch them. It's scary when I think what would have happened to me if I had seen. I mean, scary enough. I mean, that I just ran into stuff outside the home, but to know that children are watching that kind of thing today, or can pick up their phone and dial away for it or send away for it. But I'll tell you, there are lots of other kids playing in streets around this country today who are going to be dead tomorrow and the next day and the next day and next month because other young people are reading the kinds of things and seeing the kinds of things that are available in the media today.
Ted, as you would imagine, there's tremendous cynicism about you on the outside, and I suppose for good reason. I'm not sure that there's anything that you could say that people would believe. Some people would believe.
Yeah.
And yet, you told me last night, and I've heard this through our mutual friend John Tanner, that you have accepted the forgiveness of Jesus Christ and are a follower and a believer in Him. Do you draw strength from that as you approach these final hours?
I do. I can't say that
it's going to be
being
easy.
in the valley of the shadow of death is something that I've become all that accustomed to, and that I'm strong and nothing's bothering me. Listen, it's no fun. It gets kind of lonely, and yet I have to remind myself that every one of us will go through this someday, in one way or another, and countless millions who have walked this earth before us have. So this is just an experience which we all share.
Yeah.
Here I am.
He
said that he was raised in a very happy home. He was not abused as a child. He was not abused sexually. He was not abused physically or emotionally. And that he saw himself as coming out of a relatively happy, whole home where there was a lot of love, and where what happened to him cannot be attributed to major mistakes on the part of his family. He feels that he ran into trouble when he was 12 or 13 years of age, and he began to find pornography in the drugstores. He found some of it along the road that had been discarded. He began to be addicted to it. It became an obsession with him. And as he went through the adolescent years, he continued down that progressive road of wanting ever more violent and hardcore material. I think it's genuine. I realize that this man is perhaps the most... There was a great deal of remorse. He wept several times while talking to me. He expressed great regret and remorse for what he had done for the families that were hurting. A time or two where I asked him explicit questions, he was so choked up that he was not able to answer me. Did I believe Ted Bundy in his expression of remorse? Yes, I did believe him. I think it's genuine. I realize that this man is
we know he's in hell.
He was one of the most notorious serial killers in the nation. And did you know even Utah felt the effects of Ted Bundy?
Yeah, Bundy was executed in Florida, 1989, for 3 murders that happened in that state. But 2 days before he was executed, he confessed to killing 3 young women right here in Utah. He was also suspected of killing 2 others and kidnapping another teenager in Murray. Tonight, Good for Utah's Marcos Ortiz begins a special assignment with the first of 3 parts on Bundy's legacy of pain in Utah.
It was a good life, and then it totally destroyed.
He ruined our lives, and he's still part of your life, unfortunately.
The lives of Connie Wilcox and Belva Kent will be forever linked by the horrific memory of their daughter's brutal murders at the hands of Ted Bundy. Bundy was one of America's most notorious serial killers, a kidnapper, rapist, and necrophile. Before his 1989 execution, Bundy confessed to murdering 30 young women in 7 states during the 1970s.
He was not mentally ill in the sense of somebody who was psychotic, didn't know what he was doing. He knew very much what he was doing.
And it was that very normal but charismatic image of a preppy college student that allowed Bundy to get close to young women who would become his victims. He first arrived in Salt Lake City in August 1974 to study law at the University of Utah. But in the fall, young women started disappearing. Nancy Wilcox was the first, a 16-year-old who walked out of her home in Holiday, never to return.
The minute she went out the door, I had the strangest feeling.
2 weeks later, Melissa Smith, the Midvale police chief's daughter, vanished. Her nude body was later found in the mountains. She had been strangled and raped. 3 weeks later, 17-year-old Laura Amy disappeared near Lehigh. Her body was also found in the mountains, beaten, raped, and strangled. 23-year-old Nancy Baird of Layton disappeared from a gas station where she worked. Her body has never been found. On November 8th, 18-year-old Carol Durant was taken by a stranger at Fashion Place Mall in Murray. She managed to escape. Later that night, Debbie Kent disappeared after leaving a play at Viewmont High School.
Called everybody we could call to see if they had seen her, or she just left with somebody else to go pick up our kids or whatever. And no one had seen her.
At first, Bountiful police considered her a runaway. The Kents kept searching. They've kept the front porch light on for Debbie for 40 years now.
It burns out occasionally when we put a new bulb in, but it's just kind of, I don't know, it's just kind of like she's not home yet, so why turn it out?
For Connie Wilcox, her daughter's disappearance consumed her day and night.
I thought, you know what? what's going on? I mean, I didn't know what to think. I was just sick. You know, I was just sick. I didn't know what to think. It was like we were just clinging on, just waiting to find out something. And then day after day after day after day, and nothing.
At the time, Wilcox and Kent had no idea who they were dealing with. Bundy left a trail of victims behind in Washington state in 1974. Police across parts of the Northwest were investigating the disappearances of 9 women. The only clue was a young man named Ted who might be driving a Volkswagen.
And when we come back, you'll learn of an empty gravesite and a small reminder of Debbie Kent. Good for Utah's Marcus Ortiz continues with Bundy's legacy of pain right after the break.
The year is 1978. President Jimmy Carter rides high as he shares a Nobel Peace Prize. But conflict continues in the Middle East as Israeli troops move into the Lebanon. The United States makes another leap forward in space technology as the shuttle is rolled out. And on the 15th of February, a man is arrested in Florida who eventually confesses to 23 murders. Nearly all the victims were young and pretty, with a strong resemblance to each other, and to a girl who once turned him down. The police were fairly sure he had killed at least 15 others as well. On the 15th of January 1978, a student had been found in Tallahassee, raped, beaten and strangled in the Chi Omega sorority house. Her name was Margaret Bowman. In a nearby room, also dying, was Lisa Levy. Her body had been savagely bitten. Also attacked, but alive, in the same sorority house were these girls, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner. 90 minutes later, Cheryl Thomas was brutalized in her bed by the same man. 3 weeks later, in Lake City, a 12-year-old schoolgirl disappeared. Kimberly Leach's body was found in a river 2 months later. The following week, a patrolman stopped a stolen car. The driver, here led by the police, said he was called Chris Hagen, but wouldn't give any more information about himself. Then he claimed he was Kenneth R. Meisner of Tallahassee, but this turned out to be just one of the names on the many stolen credit cards he had acquired. It took several days for the Florida police to realize they had caught the most wanted man in America, Theodore Robert Bundy. He was on the run after having escaped from Aspen, Colorado, during pre-trial hearings for the murder of another pretty girl. So now the Florida police looked for any links with the recent murders and disappearances of young women locally. Bundy strongly denied all their accusations, quite confident that no evidence existed to link him with any of the brutal killings in the sorority house and afterwards. But his composure slipped when the police followed up the bite marks left on Lisa Levy. He violently resisted, and 6 men had to hold him down in his cell to take wax impressions and these photographs. The pattern of his teeth fitted with the marks on Lisa Levy's buttocks. Now he set about charming his captors. Everyone who met Ted Bundy agreed that he was intelligent, cultured, and personable. Very few people could believe he was a crook, let alone one of the most savage serial killers ever. What they couldn't know was that he was a classic psychopath, internally raging and able to kill without remorse. Unusually for a serial killer, he was also very attractive to women, which was why so many girls fatally allowed themselves to be picked up by him.
Ted Bundy was a charmer. He charmed the shoes off of him.
He was thoughtful, charismatic.
He was an enjoyable, likable, attractive person.
Born illegitimate in Philadelphia in 1946, Bundy was an intelligent but lonely child. At Stanford University, he got engaged to a girl who had dark hair parted in the center, but she broke it off, saying he was emotionally immature. Psychiatrists have speculated that this was the trigger which set him off. Nearly all the 40 girls who were later to disappear when they came into contact with Ted Bundy had center-parted dark hair as well. In California, he volunteered to help the local Republicans, but was soon in trouble for dirty tricks. When found out, he was boyishly unrepentant and typically charming.
It's hard for me to believe that what I did is newsworthy, and my part in the campaign was so insignificant, I'm embarrassed that I should be getting this publicity from it. Really embarrassed.
At the end of the 1960s, he moved to Seattle, got a psychology degree, and entered law school. In 1974, girls started to disappear. On the 31st of January, Linda Ann Healy, a 21-year-old student at the University of Washington, went missing. Then Donna Mason, a 19-year-old student at Evergreen State College, never returned from a jazz concert. Susan Rancourt, another student aged 18, went to a movie and disappeared. Roberta Parks, aged 22, vanished on a late-night walk. An unknown man left this bar, the Flame Tavern, near Seattle Airport, with Brenda Ball. She was never seen alive again. Her ravaged body was found months later on nearby Taylor Mountain. With it were several other decomposing corpses, including that of the first Seattle victim, Linda Ann Healy. Then George Ann Hawkins, aged 18, walked back alone to her Washington University sorority house, but never reached it. The beach at Lake Sammamish was crowded on the 14th of July, 1974. A man called Ted, with his arm in a sling, asked several women to help load a boat onto his car. At least 2 refused, but Janice Ott, aged 23, agreed to go with him and disappeared. Soon after, Denise Naslund also went missing from the beach. Their decomposed bodies were found together near the lake on the 7th of September, along with those of another unidentified female. Other remains were found in the area too. Now the police had something to go on, since several girls could remember the man. They issued a photo-fit picture, which turned out to be remarkably accurate. More women came forward when they saw it, to tell of having been approached by a man with his arm in a sling. There were eventually 3,500 suspects on the state computer. Number 7 was Ted Bundy, but by the time the police reached his name, he had moved on. In August 1974, the disappearances in Washington ceased. Bundy was in Salt Lake City, and women started disappearing there. Nancy Wilcox, age 16, high school cheerleader, was last seen in a Volkswagen on the 2nd of October. Her body was never found. Melissa Smith hitched a ride on the 18th of October. She was found strangled. Laura Aim vanished and was slaughtered on Halloween. But Carol DeRodge, age 19, turned out to be a tougher proposition. In the Salt Lake City parking lot, a phony cop got her into his Volkswagen, then snapped handcuffs on her. She managed to get away, but later she failed to recognize a photograph of Bundy. Over the next 6 months, a series of other girls disappeared in the Salt Lake City area. The last, on the 1st of July, was Nancy Baird, an attendant from this gas station in Golden, Colorado. On the 16th of August, 1975, Sergeant Bob Haywood challenged a suspicious Volkswagen. It drove off wildly. Stopped after a chase, it proved to contain masks and handcuffs. The driver was arrested. It was Ted Bundy. Forensic scientists had combed the car and found a hair that could have been Melissa Smith's. Witnesses also reported seeing him where one of the girls had disappeared. Carol DeRonch, who had escaped from his car after being handcuffed, picked him out of a lineup. When credit card slips proved he was lying when he said he had never been to Colorado, he was charged with kidnapping and attempted murder. Other states became interested. After a legal battle lasting 13 months, he was found guilty of aggravated kidnapping. He then faced further charges.
I have got to keep myself together. I have got to stay calm. I've got to keep my presence of mind, because as long as I do that, I'm going to beat these people.
His first attempt to beat them was an unexpected escape. Released from his chains and left in the courthouse library, he jumped from this window. The local sheriff was surprisingly relaxed.
When was you last seen? Oh, about 10:30 this morning when he jumped from the window.
Have there been any hostage-type situations or stolen cars reported?
No, not yet.
While helicopters searched for him, he hid out in a cabin on Aspen Mountain for 5 days before coming back through the roadblocks to steal a car. He was rearrested a few blocks from where he had escaped. So now he slimmed down, until at the end of 1977 he was thin enough to make another escape. This time through a hole he cut in the ceiling of his cell. By the time the alarm was raised, he had driven to Denver in a stolen car and hopped a plane to Chicago. From there he flew to Florida, where his urge to kill overwhelmed him. Shortly after the Tallahassee and Lake City killings came his capture in the stolen car. Despite the telltale tooth marks, the state authorities were afraid they didn't have a certain case. They offered a deal: plead guilty and they wouldn't request the death sentence. Bundy contemptuously refused. He also complained during the pre-trial hearings that his defense team had shut him out of preparations, but the judge was unimpressed.
This court is finding clearly, unequivocally, you've had the most excellent counsel I've ever seen any defense attorney in any defendant in the state of Florida ever had.
Nevertheless, Bundy insisted on taking over his own defense, and the court had to rule on whether he was sane enough to be able to do so.
The man is difficult to work with. He's almost cunning in the way that he works against his lawyers sometimes, and he reaches a level where he's unbearably hard to work with. But all of that notwithstanding, the doctors told us that it does not meet the test for legal insanity, legal incompetence.
As he took over, Bundy clashed with the trial judge, Edward Coward.
Mr. Bundy?
Yes, sir.
The court wants to talk to you, man. Come up to the bar here. I want to tell you something, young man, and I want to tell you clearly and unequivocally so you understand. This court is not going to follow your schedule.
Since I have been in Dade County, I have been allowed to...
Don't shake your finger at me, young man. Don't shake your finger at me, young man.
Bundy had been protesting about not being allowed in the library to prepare his defense, and he continued with delaying tactics, which had the trial moved from Tallahassee to Miami and put back from October 1978 to June 1979. When the jury had finally been selected, Bundy shrewdly won some key legal points, getting both his record and his taped statements ruled inadmissible. The policeman who made the arrest described how Bundy fought him, knocking his gun from his hand. He then went on to report what Bundy said when he was subdued.
He made these statements several times on the way back to the station that he wished I'd killed him. On the way back to the station, he also made the statement, "If I run at the jail, will you shoot me then?"
With his law school background, Bundy was dispassionate and professional.
Can you describe what you saw when you lifted up the cover? As much detail as you can recall. If you need to use your report, please feel free to do so.
There was a considerable amount of blood
around her head, matted in her hair on the walls. There was what appeared to be a nylon stocking netted around her neck.
And you cannot recall any debris other than blood? Is that your testimony? Is that your recollection?
That's the best of my recollection, yes, sir.
Bundy claimed that the prosecution's exhibits could all be innocently explained. The masks found in his car were for skiing. The metal pipes were not weapons, but parts of his car. The nylon stockings not for strangling, but for wearing. The prosecutor said that, on the contrary, they all proved that the crimes had been carefully planned.
This man premeditated this murder. He knew what he was going to do before he did it. He thinks he is smart enough to get away with any crime.
The prosecution produced a key witness, student Nita Neary, who saw a man coming out of the sorority house that night.
What I noticed most with the profile was had a very prominent nose, a straight bridge that almost came to a point, not quite, very thin lips.
It was 3 in the morning. He was wearing a dark knitted cap and carrying a wooden club. "Do you see that man in the courtroom?" she was asked, in one of the trial's most dramatic moments. Her response was clear. This was damning enough, but the clincher was the savage bite on Lisa Levy.
The defendant in this case, Theodore Robert Bundy, was responsible for leaving those bite marks on the buttocks of Lisa Levy.
Bundy claimed they weren't his, but dental evidence was overwhelming. Knowing that this was a critical point, he took the stand to deny it.
What is your name, please?
Theodore Robert Bundy.
When you were arrested on February 15th, 1978 in Pensacola, did you have a chip in your right front tooth?
No, I did not.
He used all his ingenuity to weaken the evidence.
Then that evidence would tend to show that in fact my teeth could not or did not make those marks.
Fully aware of the importance of this point, the state produced a further expert whose testimony was damning when asked to comment on Bundy's claims.
In my opinion, the only set that could have caused all the characteristics in the photograph of the bite mark would be number 2.
The models of Mr. Bundy?
Yes, sir.
The trial took a month, but on the 23rd of July, 1979, the jury needed only 7 hours to reach their verdicts on a long list of indictments. The clerk of the court was handed the decisions. Could this impressive and articulate young man really be a wild sex killer?
Publish the verdicts, Madam Clerk.
In the Circuit Court of the Second Judicial Circuit in Leon County, Florida, case number 78670, with the jury at Miami-Dade County, Florida, this 24th day of July, AD 1979, find the defendant, Theodore Robert Bundy, as to count 3 of the indictment, murder in the first degree upon one Lisa Levy, guilty as charged, so say we all, Rudolph E. Trimble, foreman.
The verdict was guilty, and all that Bundy could do now was to try to avoid a death sentence. With his usual cheek, he said that if he was sentenced to death, it would lower the court to the level of a murderer.
I'm not asking for mercy, for I find it somewhat absurd to ask for mercy for something I did not do.
As Bundy's mother listened, the judge had no hesitation in passing the death sentence.
She was struck several times about the head. She had a ligature around her neck, which was a pantyhose that strangled her, caused her death. The beating was vicious, vile, and wicked and atrocious. It is further ordered that on such scheduled date that you be put to death by a current of electricity sufficient to cause your immediate death, and such current of electricity shall continue to pass through your body until you are dead.
However, Judge Edward Coward had extraordinary words of praise for his performance in the courtroom.
It's a tragedy for this court to see such a total waste, I think, of humanity that I've experienced in this court. You're a bright young man. If you made a good lawyer, I'd love to have you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner.
So he left the courtroom in Miami a condemned man, to be taken to Orlando for another trial, this time for the murder of schoolgirl Kimberly Leach. In an extraordinary scene during this, he called his girlfriend Carol Boone to the stand and asked her to marry him.
Will you marry me? Yes. And I do hereby marry you. Thank you.
She accepted, and they had a daughter during the years of his appeals. But extravagant gestures could not influence the verdict.
Therefore, it is the sentence of this court as to count one of the indictment that you, Theodore Robert Bundy, be adjudicated guilty of murder in the first degree, and that you be sentenced to death for the murder of Kimberly Diane Leach.
There followed almost 9 years of appeals. One point which emerged was that Bundy claimed that he had been spurred on by pornography. Anti-porn crusaders leapt at this revelation as confirming their worst fears. Dr. Victor Klein, a psychiatrist who had made a study of the effects, summed up their views.
They get into this pattern, it's a sexual addiction, and they act it out. And even good people can or are vulnerable to it.
But lawyer John Weston took a sterner view.
It's also a way for Bundy to check out by, in essence, saying the devil made me do it.
Officials speculated as to how many women Bundy really had killed.
My feeling is that he's killed way over 100.
When his last appeal failed, Bundy tried to delay his execution by starting to confess. His mother was devastated.
We don't want to believe that these things happened, but it sounds like at least some of them did, unless he's making it all up. Why would he make it up?
When even this tactic failed, he used pleading.
What I'm talking about is going beyond retribution, which is what people want with me. Going beyond retribution and punishment, because there is no way in the world that killing me is going to restore those beautiful children to their parents and correct and soothe the pain.
But at last, 9 years after the sentence, the state of Florida prepared for retribution. Press and angry crowds gathered outside the prison. At 7 o'clock on the morning of the 24th of January, 1989, Ted Bundy finally went to the electric chair.